So we've been talking about church history, and the sort of theme we've been following under the thesis is that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and that God has been advancing his kingdom from the beginning, especially since Christ until now, and it's still at this moment is advancing. That everywhere across the globe, from north to south to east to west, there are people who are meeting to worship the Lord. There are people whose lives are being changed right now. There are hearts who are being changed from stone into flesh. There are people who are putting their faith in Christ, people being baptized, standing in the water as we speak, because the kingdom of God, the church, has continued to advance. We've been looking at this through like the primary turning points in church history, and we've seen these so far. We started with the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in AD 66 to AD 73, the temple falling in AD 70. And then we looked at the guardrails that the church set up after that to sort of help the church have structure, mainly the canon being scriptures and creeds and church order. And then we looked at the Council of Nicaea and Constantine as the emperor of Rome, where Constantine made it first Christianity tolerable and then made Christianity functionally the national religion of Rome after that. And he leads this church council to establish Christ's divinity, which we now call the Council of Nicaea. Then in 425, we looked at last week, the Council of Chalcedon, where they established Christ's humanity, where the pendulum swang from talking about is Christ really God to is Christ truly man, and they established that at Chalcedon, which we looked at last week, Christ's full humanity, and we said Christ better be fully God or we have no hope. Christ better be fully man or we have no hope. For him to be the mediator between God and man, for him to be the bridge that we can cross into knowing God, he must be both God and man. And so these things very early, we're establishing those things as facts. And of course, being very significant that Constantine, being the emperor of Rome, changed Christianity from being this sort of pilgrim, persecuted, outsider thing into quite literally the state religion, functionally, of the empire of Rome for the many years to come. So, creedally, the Council of Nicaea said that God is one being in which is three persons. One being God, three persons, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And Chalcedon said that Jesus himself was one person with two natures, both a divine nature and a human nature. Okay, so what we're talking about today is really a pretty big thing. And we'll come back, of course, in the middle. But what we're talking about today is this thing that really dominates the church for that long of time. Really from 300, especially from 500, for the next 1,000 years. And that is what we're calling the next turning point, which is monastic. There's a few words we could have gone with here, but I went with reform. Monastic reform of the church. Monastic meaning monks, right? Monks and nuns and stuff. What do you know about monks? What do you know about nuns? Can you think of any that come to mind by name that you have heard of or that you know of? Give me anything at all you know about these folks. Mother Teresa is the most recent famous one. She died about there, and still extremely significant, extremely influential because of her celibacy. That's right. Lives of service. Lives of service. Celibate means that they don't, well, you know what it means. Lives of service. Yes. What does that mean? Oh, Guido Durexa? I don't know Durexa. The what system? Did you say? Oh, okay, music guy. I thought you said the soul food system that we use. Yeah. Which would have, that guy deserves some praise. Let's call him a saint. Yeah.
He was the biggest reformer in music.
Tell me his name again.
Guido Durexa.
Durexa.
Yeah, he was Guido from Durexa.
Yeah. Cool. Very good. What else? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Taylor. Well, so Taylor. Taylor asked, are they all part of the Catholic Church? And the answer to that is complicated. So it just depends what you mean by that. If the Sister Act, yeah, Whoopi Goldberg, great. Nacho Libre, yeah, The Conjuring, yeah. That's good. All those are good. We're really highbrow in this church with our It's hard to. Sister Act 2 was one of the only sequels I liked better than the original.
They do a lot of orphan.
A lot of benevolence. Yep, not a lot of benevolence. What? Sound of Music. Yes. Quick answer, Taylor. Are they all part of the Catholic Church? Both yes and no. But what you mean by that is, are they part of what we call the Roman Catholic Church now? And they are now, but traditionally, the Roman Catholic Church really didn't come around until historically recently, but at least the way we understand it today, which we'll talk about. Catholic, the church was referred to as the Catholic Church for 1,000 years, and the word Catholic just means general, basically, the worldwide church, the Church Catholic. And it became its own big C letter thing. But so they're all part of the Catholic Church with a little c, but not necessarily Catholic Church with a big C. But today, yes, all are part of the Catholic Church, or at least the Orthodox Church. Okay, so the first monk that we know of, at least we call him a monk, though he didn't really call himself a monk, was a guy named Antony in 270 AD. And then the first monastery, which is the place where monks live, which is what monks are centered around ever since then, was built in 320. So about 5 years. So after Constantine had given the Edict of Milan, about a decade after that, about 7 years after that, and then 5 years before Constantine had the Council of Nicaea, there was the first monastery. But monasticism, monasticism, really began to flourish in this time period. Is when it really became the thing that it was for the next 1,000 years. It really was central to the faith of Christ. Alex, will you close that door for me? I'm sorry to do that to you. Okay, so why did monasticism start? What I want to answer first. Why did it begin? The best answer is we don't really know. We don't have a lot of information about why monasticism, monkness began. When Antony first left in 270, it was amidst, of course, there was terrible persecution going on, very much unrest in the world, and he left his home and went out basically into a cave to live on his own and to find God, is basically what he did. And people then emulated that and kind of did the same thing. But the massive majority of monasticism, of the monks, developed in the mid-300s and later, after Constantine took over. And so I'm going to give you the basic reason, at least the general reason why monasticism began. But let me give you that answer by asking you a question. So Christianity was once this persecuted body where it was very costly to be a Christian. And then, almost overnight, historically, it becomes not only tolerated, but the empire religion, where the emperor of Rome is now Christian and wants everybody to be Christians. Okay, so just brainstorming, what issues do you think that sort of state religionness could cause to real Christianity? What could be problems with the state governmentally being, quote, Christian? What issues could that cause that would be different than when they were persecuted? Anything that comes to mind? Potential.
Anytime you try to force values and morals, it never works.
Yeah, it's not going to go well.
And that's the biggest thing I think they had trouble with to start with, is now all of a sudden stuff that may have been okay under a pagan religion or
Yeah.
a pagan god is no longer valid, and vice versa.
Yeah, no doubt.
That you had been told was wrong, and because the biggest reason they hated Christianity because they considered it wasn't polytheistic.
Right. It wasn't worshiping the gods. Yep, no doubt. No doubt. What else? Yeah, so you end up with people that see it as a government rebellion even more than a spiritual rebellion. Let me ask it like this. I think we have very similar issues today in southeastern America, where Christianity is not persecuted, where it's not costly to be a Christian. What are some disadvantages of Christianity not being costly, where it's not costly to say, I'm a Christian? Christian by default, meaning you're a Christian because you're born that way and you're a Christian, and it doesn't really matter what you believe, you're just a Christian because you're a Christian. No doubt taken for granted, yeah. And yeah, you don't have to worry about the cost. Fair weather Christians, you can be a Christian. Complacency. Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Yeah, you end up with a lot of what we have in the Southeast, where you have people that claim to be a Christian, but you wouldn't know it by their lives if they didn't tell you that, right? Which is referred to as, let me use a different marker, referred to as nominalism. So you're going to hear me use that phrase a lot, which just means in name only, just a name. So if you're a nominal Christian, you're just a Christian because you use the name, but you're not actually a Christian. It doesn't affect your life. And so think about that sort of pendulum swing over 100 years' time, where in 250 AD, you were giving up everything to be a Christian. And so the only people who would say they were a Christian, knowing what it would cost them, were those who really and truly believed it, because it was such a high cost to be a Christian. And then in 350 AD, just 100 years later, not only is it not difficult to say a Christian, you better say you're a Christian. The emperor's a Christian. So you have these new kind of problems where Christianity becomes just default. Of course I'm a Christian. Well, who isn't? As opposed to, yes, I would give my life up for Christ. So you end up with a lot of those kind of cold, less focused on the Christian truth thing. And so what happened from monasticism was this effort to refocus Christianity on what Christianity actually is. Not this sort of state governmental thing, but this heart thing. This thing that actually affects the way that I live and that we actually believe and think is true. And monasticism was, in a large way, an answer to that sort of cold governmental state religionness that says we need to get back to what their phrase was, living martyrdom. Or living lives that cost us something is the basic idea. And so what happened largely with monasticism is there was this place in society where there was no cost to be a Christian, and monasticism in a large part put the cost back. So if you want to be a Christian, it's going to cost you. Now, we're going to talk about the things that weren't great about it, but there were many things that were great. But you guys mentioned the celibacy, but monks were have always been known for, and still are, that. But that's part of a view or part of a lifestyle called asceticism. Anybody want to define asceticism for me? Yeah. It's severe self-discipline. It's really a self-denial. And especially at this point, what asceticism was the view that, or at least it was tied to the view that physical pleasures are bad things. Really. Maybe they wouldn't say they're bad all the time, but they definitely wouldn't say they're not good. They're not good in and of themselves. And so, say that. Yeah. You're indulging in fleshly things or material things. And so monks were known as people who denied themselves those things, which included marriage and the benefits that come along with that, and many other things. They would deny themselves eating beyond certain amounts. They would deny themselves even sleep. They would deny themselves all kinds of things. And there's still ascetics in the world, but the monks are known for that, denying themselves. So the reason they did this largely was again, because of a response to nominalism. So if you're not really a Christian, then you're partaking in all the pleasures. What do you care? Right? And again, we see that today. Well, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I still sleep with whoever I want to. Well, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm still going to do what I want on the weekends. Well, yeah, I'm a Christian, but... And so the monks say, no. Now, they swung the pendulum probably too far in the other direction. Not probably, they did. But it was for good reason. They wanted to bring back the holiness of what it means to follow God. And so they said, no, we're going to deny all those things. We're going to deny all those things. And then secondly, and we talked about this some last week, and I don't want to get too philosophy jargon, but the basic view of Plato that was passed on and was really prevalent at the time, and like it's hard to describe how prevalent this view was. It was so prevalent they didn't realize it was in them, but they all believed it. Was the view that the material world, we talked about this last week with Luann a little bit, the material world is a bad thing, and the spiritual world is what's real. Right? Plato had this idea of the ideals that are above material, and the material things are just shadows of the real things. He had this famous Plato's cave. You heard of Plato's cave? It's this illustration that if you probably heard in college and you forgot if you don't remember it. But it's this illustration. He said basically what reality is imagine a man who is chained, his head and arms and all that chained to the back of a wall, and then behind that wall there's a fire lit, and the real world is on the other side of that fire. And so the real world is projecting shadows on the wall in front of him. but all he's ever seen is the wall in front of him. So he thinks the shadows are what's real, when what's real is back there. And so the Platonic view, in large part, was what we're experiencing here is just shadows, and spiritual things are the real things. Material things are not even real, are lowly, or even, it got to the point where Christian people were saying that material things are demonic. They're of the devil. This is the devil's realm. And so that infiltrated everything. And again, they didn't even realize that they thought that. It's almost like today, one of our modern things like that is freedom and equality. Like we just assume that freedom is a good thing in all situations, and I'm not, whatever. This is one of our assumptions, that freedom is always good, that equality is always good. Now, what's interesting about that is people haven't thought that until pretty recently. Like, freedom wasn't a high value, equality especially wasn't a high value until relatively recently historically. But it's in us so much so that you could start there with any atheist. Well, we can agree that freedom is good, right? You could start there. There's no reason that they have to start there, but you could start there because down deep in us is that truth. In the same way, in the early church, in the first 100 years, Platonism was such a big thing that at the bottom of them was this view that the material things were bad and the spiritual things were better. And so in that sense, asceticism was by its nature good because you were denying physical things in effort to get more in touch with spiritual things. So that's why the monks are what they are. That's why they do what they do, because they were responding to nominalism and because they had this idea in them that flesh was bad and whatever you could do to deny the flesh was then necessarily good. One early monk said, the ideal Christian life is a passing from the ordinary material and terrestrial into the extraordinary spiritual and celestial. And so if flesh is bad, then eating is bad, just necessary. Sex is bad. That's why many monks, especially early ones, were known for being hermits. They would just go off in a cave and they'd live in the cave by themselves their whole lives. People would go seek advice from them, but they would just live in the cave. One famous one built a tower. We don't really know how he built it, but he built a tower and he lived on top of that tower. And people would bring him nourishment that he would lower down a bucket and they would raise the bucket to him and they'd ask him a question. If you've seen what's that movie, the Disney movie where all the trees die? And the Lorax. Have you seen the Lorax? You read the Lorax. There's a guy that lives in a tower. That's probably a reference to that old monk. Anyway, so a lot of stuff like that where they're denying themselves, denying fleshly, physical pleasures, worldly pleasures, and that's why they got to that point. And they took a lot of passages and kind of did a lot with them. Don't worry about what you'll eat or what you'll wear, Matthew 6, about your body. And they would take that literally.
Wasn't that the big argument about Christ, though? Wasn't that what they're fighting about, is Christ could not be of God because
yes.
God couldn't create matter and it was good? So
Yes.
it had to be.
Right. That was one of the big issues early was a view that got a name Docetism for the kind of leaders of it. But it was a view that there's no way Jesus could have really been human because flesh is bad, right? And so there was that direct, part of those whole debates was the idea that God couldn't have taken on flesh because flesh is inherently evil. Yeah, Taylor.
So how did they fight off
I'm working there. We're getting there in a sense. So they saw those things, and they had biblical arguments they would make. Things like when Paul says, I'd rather you all be single like I am and not be married. It's good not to have sexual relations with a woman, etc. 1 Corinthians 7, those things, ideas. The fact that John the Baptist lived a life that was kind of hermity? Sounds...
We know what you mean.
Life of a hermit. Even Jesus himself never had a home, was always wandering, was homeless and poor and all those things. So they were mimicking those things. Additionally, there was a very high view in the first century. They were very excited about angels and demons and spiritual warfare. And there was the idea that since the monks were denying their physicalness, they were the only ones really that could play a part in the spiritual warfare between angels and demons. That they were so in touch with spiritual things that they could pray and their prayers are more involved in those things. So it ended up sort of creating this sort of two-tier Christianity where monks were like the real Christians. They were called the athletes of God, the monks. And then everyone else was just kind of, sort of kind of not really Christians, at least not the fullest extent of Christians. Okay, what were the monks good? What was good about that? For over 1,000 years, I've erased it, from 300 to really to like 1450 or so. For over 1,000 years, the primary way that Christianity was advanced and presented in its most beautiful and truest and noblest form was by those in the monastic way. They were the reason Christianity expanded in the mission field was almost exclusively because of the monks. There was intense expansion by the monks. The Middle Ages, which is about 500 to 1500, give or take, is generally divided into two sections. 500 to 1000, the church was a missionary effort to what was called the barbarians, to the non-civilized people. They were bringing the gospel, and that was almost entirely the monks, like St. Patrick, who we now worship St. Patrick. We celebrate St. Patrick's Day in odd ways. But St. Patrick was this wonderful Christian man who brought the gospel to Ireland and even to Great Britain. Bonaventure, and there's all the great missionaries that literally brought the gospel into the places that we now know as France and Germany and all these other places. The missionaries were monks, and the way they would do it very often was the monastery would advance the gospel, and then they'd build another monastery, and then that monastery would advance it a little further, and they'd build another monastery, and so they were advancing the gospel into the world through their monkey work. And then the second half, the 1000 to 1500 was sort of like the beginning again, where Christianity had become basically the religion in some sense of the world, right? Along with Islam was growing at the time, but it had reached the corners of Europe, and they were now dealing with nominalism as we deal with today. And so that 1000 to 1500 was them combating nominalism, people that were Christians just in name only. Noel says virtually all cross-cultural proclamation of the gospel in that 1,000 years was done by monks and friars, which are an extension of that. Additionally, virtually all scripture study, sitting down and studying the Bible, was done by monks. Virtually all, in fact, all that we know of, copying of manuscripts that we've talked about, the passing down of all the Bibles and translating Bibles to different nations. As they were advancing the gospel into new places, they would translate the Bible so they could bring it to those people. And so these translations happened because of the monks and because of their evangelisms. The copies of manuscripts that we have that are now thousands upon thousands were done by the monks who took great care and knew the value of the Word of God, and who knows the impact that all of their prayers had for those 1,000 years. We won't know that until glory. Some of the most learned people that have ever existed, some of the smartest people that have ever existed, some of the most brilliant writers that have ever existed were monks. It was said in the Middle Ages that the monks civilized Europe via cruce, libro, et atro. They said if they had bumper stickers back then, that would have been one. Cruce, libro, et atro, meaning by cross, book, and like a hoe, like a farming hoe, is basically what that is. And the reason they say that is because the monks were preaching the truth of the cross. They were bringing books literally into existence and to the world, primarily the Bible, but also more than that, prolific writers. And also they were prolific farmers, where they would go into these communities and they would establish these basically farmlands and would help these people learn how to till the soil. And quite literally, we're civilizing Europe. That the reason we have Europe is the way that it is because the monks were advancing the gospel, and in doing so, they were these great beneficiaries of the community and helping those people with a wide variety of benevolence. They became the best in the world at doing things like draining swamps and clearing forests and breeding cattle and sheep and farming in different farmlands. They invented much of the farming we still use today, and processes like rotating crops to keep the soil properly nutritioned. All these things happened by the monks. So, cruce, libro, et atro. The monks were advancing the gospel by the cross, by the book, and by the farming, by that process. Okay, the technical turning point of monasticism's impact is this thing called Benedict's rule, which really turned monasticism into what it was. Saint Benedict, his regula, which everything in Latin is cooler, his rule for monks that would be held by virtually all monasteries, certainly in the West, for until today, still being used. What he wrote was basically, this is how monks are to live, and he wrote things that were helping fight against the bad things that monasticism had become. For instance, some monastics had gone off into not leaning on the scriptures and just kind of feeling it. You know what I mean? Of course you do, because you know people like that. They just they look for visions and look for things, and that's fine, But everything must be grounded in the scriptures. And so he did that. He grounded monasticism in the scriptures, and apart from that, those other things. He helped bring the monks back from asceticism, where he talked about the good of work and of labor and of those things, ordinary things in the world, and other things as well. He had sort of philosophical rules, like forbidding all personal possessions. Monks could not have personal possessions unless the abbot certified that it was okay. You probably know that Mother Teresa had like 4 things to her name when she died, something like that. All things just being necessities. But also there were very practical things, like he said that older monks should room with younger monks. And this is what he wrote: so that when the bell rung at midnight for prayers, all might rise without delay, so they might quietly encourage each other, for the sleepy like to make excuses. Okay, so here's the basic schedule of the monk. And it varied. He allowed some flexibility, but this is a basic schedule of what a monk's life was. 6 a.m. he would rise and go to prime in the church, which is just one of the liturgies. It's kind of like a church service. And then that lasted about a half hour. Then they'd have breakfast, and then they would work, whether that be in the garden or reading. From 9 to 10, that's 6 to 9. 9 to 10, they would have chapter mass in the church. 10 to 11, they would have chapter meeting in the chapter house. 11 to 12, they had high mass in the church. 12 to 2, they had lunch, and then siesta, which means nap. And then 2 to 4, they had nuns in the church, which is another liturgy. And that lasted about a half hour, and then they worked for the other hour and a half. At 4 to 6, they had vespers in the church, lasted about a half hour, and then they worked until 6. 6 to 7, they had supper, and then at 7, they had compline, which is another liturgy, and then evening prayers with the church, and then bed around 9. And then at midnight, they would have Martins in the church, which was another liturgy, so they'd rise out of bed, go to the church for about an hour, have another service, prayer, and then back to bed. Hence the need for the siesta. So it was, and that was every day. That's Monday through Sunday, Sunday to Sunday, every day. That was their lives. They spent countless hours praying, countless hours studying the Bible, countless hours working those fields that they owned, often large plots of land where they would cultivate land. Mark Knoll says this: the rise of monasticism after Christ's commission to his disciples. So underneath Christ's commission to his disciples, the rise of monasticism was the most important and beneficial institutional event in the history of Christianity. Okay, negatives and positives, and then we're done. Should have time for questions. Negatives of monasticism is it did end up creating this sort of 2-tiered Christianity, where you had the monks up here and then everyone else. The monks up here and everyone else, as if there was separate things. But of course, we are all fully equal at the foot of the cross, regardless of our learning. We are all involved in spiritual warfare. We are all righteous equally by Christ. Second negative is asceticism, which is not good. And it comes from that Platonic idea, which a lot of us still have. Like it was so strong, it's still in our culture a little bit. A lot of us still feel that way a little bit. But it's not a biblical feeling. The biblical feeling is that God created all things good in the beginning. And that, yes, things are affected by sin, but it doesn't take away from their initial and organic beauty and good things. That eating is good. Eat and drink to the glory of God. And that ordinary labor is done to the glory of God. And that marriage and the things that come with marriage, the benefits of marriage, are done to the glory of God. That all those things are good things. And that denying yourself of those things may be good for a small minority, but that is the biblical pattern. For most, that is not good. For most, what is good are enjoying those things the way that God intended for them to be. Additionally, along with that, we shouldn't be those that withdraw from the world. We don't see any Christians doing that in the Bible. Nobody who just goes off on their own and lives their life out there. Christianity is a life in the community. It's a life with others. Certainly at the very bottom, at least, it's a life with other Christians in the body of Christ. So that sort of hermitage life is not a life that the Christian should live. Jesus didn't live that way. Even John the Baptist still had people constantly all around him living that way. Jesus' first miracle, for goodness sakes, was a miracle that kept the party going, where he changed water to wine and rejoiced in a marriage feast. So certainly Jesus wasn't opposed to marriages and wasn't even opposed to those things that were good and God intended when used appropriately. This world may be a foretaste of what is to come, but it's not a shadow. It's real, and it is good. Heaven is not disembodied, as we talked about last week. Heaven is embodied. It's eating and drinking and enjoying each other. Like Taylor said, when Christ rose from the dead, he didn't just float around and go, ooh. He ate fish and drank wine and enjoyed time with his friends. And that is a picture of what heaven's going to be for us. Not this sort of floaty, ethereal thing, but a real good thing, very much like it is here, just far better and without sin. And the third, and maybe the most substantial criticism of monasticism is that there was a tendency to lead towards what we call today legalism, or works righteousness, that you are made righteous by doing these things. That is what, it got so bad, in fact, by the time Martin Luther became a monk in the 1500s, the thing that led him to what became the Protestant Reformation was that he was overcome with the realization that he could not live up to these things, and he had nowhere to go for it. And so his leaning on the grace of Christ, which all of us are indebted to more than we know, in response to monasticism and that sort of works righteousness stuff, is what caused the Protestant Reformation, which we'll get to. Okay, positives are pretty obvious. Incredible devotion that led to who knows how many goods. Again, just their prayers alone, we won't know the good of them until glory. Great missionary efforts, very strong missionaries. We wouldn't have the Bible like we do today if it wasn't for the monks. That was the primary instrument God used to bring you the Bible, was the monks for 1,000 years. Their incredible benevolence that quite literally civilized the known world. That they brought civilization to the world, which is an incredibly good thing. That they were involved in apologetics. Maybe monks like Thomas Aquinas, maybe you've heard of him. Thomas Aquinas involved in apologetics against Islam and apologetics defending Christianity and all those things. Involved very much in that. They were some of the best learners and thinkers in the history of the world. They sought holiness to the utmost. One more quote. Monks for more than 1,000 years sustained what was most noble and most Christ-centered in the church. It's been said that we as Protestants can't hate the Catholic Church because they brought us the church and helped us survive through all the years. And of course, there's a sense in which that's true. It's more true to say the monks brought it to us. There's a real sense in which the monks have been the heart of the church for that 1,000 years, the ones in touch with the scriptures, and the ones we should be most thankful to, even though they did some things wrong, as everyone does. All right, thoughts on those things? Yes.